Hello and welcome to the cluster's introductory video. We're continuing our study in the book of 1 Samuel, and this week we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 16. Last week was Trinity Together, and so it was great to be able to join with so many of you to pray for our church and for the world. But that means it's been a couple of weeks since we're looking at 1 Samuel, and so let's remind ourselves of where we are now. Well, King Saul, despite starting well, has been rejected as king of Israel by God for a number of high-profile failures and abuses of power. The most recent was his blatant disobedience of God, who had decided that he was going to issue judgment against the Amalekites once and for all after the way they treated the Israelites while they'd been wandering the desert after the escape from Egypt. His instructions had been tough: to destroy all that belongs to them, to kill all their animals, to kill all their men, women and children. That might seem harsh to us today, but this is God in full judgment mode. They'd fought against God and his people and had remained in rebellion to him ever since. Now God was going to take action, and his chosen instrument was King Saul and the nation of Israel. But Saul had failed even in this relatively simple task. The Amalekites had been easily defeated, but Saul had taken King Agag prisoner instead of putting him to death, and the soldiers had taken for themselves the best of the animals. What's worse is that Saul didn't seem to understand what God's problem with this was. And so the prophet Samuel had to tell him that he'd been rejected as Israel's king by God. But once he got it, Saul was devastated. And when we join him today in verse 14 of our reading, he's tormented by his sin. Saul is still king, but he's reigning without the Spirit of God helping him make decisions and be a strong leader. His reign is floundering. And so it's time for a new king to be anointed, not one to take over just yet, but one to be chosen and set aside for the future. And so Samuel is off to see Jesse of Bethlehem, for one of his sons is to become the anointed one, or Messiah of Israel. One day he will become the great king of Israel, but for now he has an important role: to soothe King Saul's troubled mind with his lyre. Well, I hope you have a great cluster discussing God's word and praying for one another. Next week, we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 17 and that perennial favourite among children, the story of David and Goliath. So until then, goodbye for now.